and I think I'm done with this interview.
Wait, well, let me just show you the contract, if I could, Mr. Roberts. Wait, it says here, right in the contract, that the verification is supposed to be done by DBT, that you paid them $4 million. Don't you, it could look to other people that you paid $4 million to purchase this election for the Republican Party, Mr. Roberts?
He is an honest, equitable, hard-working man, and that's why we've supported him unequivocally. And I think he's doing a fabulous job.
It's, of course, common to say George W. Bush is, dumber than a box of rocks. But that misses the point about who George W. is. Yes, he doesn't have the brain muscle to do any heavy lifting, that's clear. But at the same time, that's not his purpose.
Iraq is free.
George W. Bush, war hero, master politician, entrepreneur, implacable commander-in-chief of the War on Terror, president in a family of presidents. For BBC Television and the Guardian papers of Britain, I've been tracking the Bush family for years.
In politics, power, turning a profit. These are masters of the game. What drives these men? And where are they driving us?
We will confront weapons of mass destruction.
Never call a Bushman weak.
Weakness and ambivalence lead to war.
Victory in Iraq completes the president's image as Top Gun warrior, cemented in the public's mind by the drama of his landing on the deck of the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln. The president makes much of his days as a fighter pilot during the war in Vietnam.
Did you see him landing the jet on the Abe Lincoln?
I thought that was one of the neatest things I had ever seen. And watching all of the soldiers on that deck with their commander-in-chief and then having him wade in and having just seeing that interaction, I just thought that was fabulous.
Fabulous to the Yale man, but not to some Texans.
It was a cheap political stunt. It was not his airplane, it was the taxpayers' airplane. They had to get the aircraft carrier to turn around so that they would get the proper view that they wanted for the cameras of Bush landing and standing before the brave troops who had indeed put their lives at risk.
Here's this politician who didn't have the guts to go do it himself, go out and put on our uniform, go out on our aircraft carrier and grandstand as if he's some type of hero.
Vietnam, 1968. Young Americans by the thousands are drafted. And while they had tough days in the jungle, some kids at Yale were having a tough day on the golf links.
A long time ago. That's the president. It's me. I haven't changed a bit. And that's Robert Dieter. Wow. All very accomplished golfers, as you can see.
And how come you don't wear a hat?
I don't know. I just don't wear a hat. I want to look different, you know.
I'm always amazed at what I see on the television, that persona and the public one and the scripted one, as opposed to the one that we knew in college and know now, where he's a very down-to-earth, relaxed, witty, funny guy.
So did you talk with your roommate about the war in Vietnam being drafted?
I think so, yeah, as I remember it. The military choice was something that all of us at that point were going to have to face in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Did you sign up, or did your number come up in the lottery for the draft?
No, I was just planning to enlist because at that time it was just inevitable that you were going to get drafted.
But the draft wasn't inevitable for the son of Congressman George Bush Sr.
Hey, this is Bob Reddy with your National Guard Hope. And I want to tell you that the story of today's Army and Air National Guard is something all Americans.
What Bob Hope doesn't mention is that getting into the Guard is a way of getting out of Vietnam. With just 12 days to go before he became subject to the draft, George Bush applies for the Air Guard. Problem for George was there are 100,000 would-be draft dodgers lined up ahead of him.
For George W. Bush to get into the Texas Air Guard, safest unit in the military, he had to take a test. And he scored out of a possible 100, 25, just 1 point above too dumb to fly. But that didn't stop young George from getting that plum position in the cockpit.
To find out how low-score George got the Top Gun job, I spoke with fighter pilot Bill White.
So, Bill, this is the plane you actually flew?
Yes.
And you flew one of these onto one of those?
No one, to my knowledge, has ever gone into the Air National Guard as a non-pilot and gotten pilot training in the Guard. That's completely unprecedented. Never happened in the history of the Guard. Every pilot that ever has served in the National Guard legitimately paid their dues, spent 3.5 years to 5 years flying on active duty. And only then were they a candidate for admission to the National Guard as a pilot.
Privilege has a price, paid by others.
We were sent there to defend our liberties. And to find out that the politicians who sent myself and the other young men to put our lives into harm's way were working a personal, selfish agenda instead of a national agenda is anathema to everything that we fought for and stood for. Yeah, it hurts me to this day to think that we would be manipulated or that they would abuse their authority. That they'd stand on television or on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier in a flight suit and be called a leader. Leadership entails responsibility. That's the whole connotation of leadership. It's service. It's giving of yourself. And that's what's killing me about this is I see that the whole system has been turned on end. We have the weak leading the strong.
So how did young George Bush get the job of defending Houston from Viet Cong attack, despite a score of 25 out of 100? The answer dropped onto my desk in Washington.
I got my hands on a letter from someone who explained how the draft dodge fix was done. It says, George Bush leaped over thousands of young men, some of whom died in Vietnam. So I tracked down one of the guys named in the letter. He confessed to the whole thing. He said he made the call at the request of someone acting in the name of Congressman George Bush Sr.
But others without congressmen for daddies went. Some did not return. An issue that would haunt George Bush Jr.'s political career. Not just whether he dodged the draft into the Guard, but also whether he even showed up for duty.
We're here today to offer a $1,000 reward to anybody who can bring tangible evidence to us, records showing us that he attended Guard duty while he was here in Alabama.
No one's claimed the reward, so I figured I'd pick up an easy $1,000 by getting George Bush's Vietnam War records in Houston.
Camp Mabry, HQ of the Texas National Guard. This is where the Vietnam War records of fighter pilot George W. Bush were supposed to be kept.
But they're missing. Who can we talk to about these disappearing records?
I think you ought to listen to what the general said, who was in charge of my unit, and he said there was no preferential treatment given.
But it's very difficult to talk to George's general. The general is dead. So I drove down to an Abilene, Texas cattle ranch to meet with the general's assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Burkett. He was very familiar with the records that would prove whether young George served his country.
This is 28 years of a military career, all boiled down to paper. This is the retirement points. All of these are orders.
But Bush's military records are oddly incomplete. What happened to those papers? Lieutenant Colonel Burkett was working in the Air Guard headquarters at Camp Mabry, talking with the general, when a telephone call came in from Governor Bush's people.
They wanted to assemble all of the governor's files. They wanted to make sure there was nothing in there that would embarrass the governor. That's as accurate as I can put it.
And you heard that off the
Yes.
voice box yourself?
Yes.
The call came in from this woman's office, Karen Hughes, Governor Bush's chief of staff.
Now, they wouldn't go along with a call from a politician and actually clean the files, would they?
Yes.
They would?
Yes.
Did they?
Yes. And there were several documents, and I saw that they had George W. Bush's name at the top of them. And this was a bin that was about to be shredded. The specific document that I do remember was a pay document. A second specific document that I remember was a retirement points document. That, in fact, might explain some tremendous gaps in the record. It makes no sense. This was during the Vietnam War, yes. And did he show up for training? There's no documentation at all that he showed up.
Are you saying that the president may have been AWOL, taken off during the war?
If you look at the definition of absent without leave, which is used to court-martial individuals, he met those ramifications of those charges. On 2 occasions, I had soldiers who did not show up for drill, not just one drill, but a second drill, and on their second drill, yes, I did refer them to the Selective Service Board, which was one of the options of a commander.
And so you basically...
They were put in priority status to go to Vietnam and find themselves a foxhole and fight with the rest of the guys.
His military career at an end, Bush eventually follows his daddy into the family businesses, oil, and in 1978, politics in Midland, Texas.
Good to see you. I'm George Bush, running for the Congress.
He lost, big. But when your daddy's president of the United States, the voters' rejection doesn't slow down your political career. In 1994, he reaches for the Lone Star.
Let's make it official. I'm a candidate for governor of Texas.
By 1995, George W. is living here in the Texas White House. He's governor of the Lone Star State, but he wants the bigger house. It's an ambition that's in his blood.
His march on Washington in 2000 would require him first to capture the Sunshine State. Hot combat over Florida's 25 decisive electoral votes would choose our president. I flew south for BBC TV to find out how George Bush took Florida away from Al Gore by the unbelievably tiny victory margin of just 537 votes. At least that's the official count. And it doesn't hurt that the man who's in charge of the count is also named Bush.
My brother, George W. Bush, the next president of the United States.
Governor Jeb Bush promised Florida to his brother, as did this woman, who also swore to deliver the state, Katherine Harris, both Florida's Secretary of State in charge of the vote count and chairwoman of the George Bush for President campaign. Nevertheless, Al Gore was running ahead of the Bushes because 250,000 African Americans lined up to register to vote.
It's going to be a close race, very close race, yeah. It's hard to tell. Flip a coin.
On November 6th, after all the votes were cast, statisticians called Florida for Gore.
It's almost 5:30 a.m. Texas time, and George W. Bush is still asleep, and I'm still speaking to people here in Florida.
Most voters in the state told exit polls they voted for Al Gore, but the Bush family remained strangely confident. Now, why did George W. grin and ignore the exit polls?
I don't believe that some of these states that they've called, like Florida, I just don't believe that. We got enough evidence to be able to call the states. We're doing better than we thought, and but I feel fine.
But what made George feel good made America feel ill. The vote count was a shambles. Machines failed, chads fell, and thousands of ballots piled up. The public was fed up.
I think they should just re-elect, start it all over again. Cancel the whole deal that's went on now, and let's vote again.
The race turned on just dozens of votes, yet incredibly, by the stroke of a pen, Katherine Harris orders a halt to the ballot count. In all, 179,855 ballots were never counted. And here's the key. More than half of those not counted were cast by black voters. In fact, in Florida, an old Jim Crow segregation state, the nasty little secret of Jeb Bush's government is that, according to this U.S. Civil Rights Commission report, a black person is 1,000% more likely to have their ballot thrown out, not counted, than a white voter. And something else seemed crooked. Thousands of black voters, when they showed up to vote, were turned away because they were listed on voter registers as convicted criminals. But were they? I met with Willie Steen. Like 94,000 others, he'd been tagged a criminal. He was not allowed to vote in Florida because Jeb's elections officials said he was a felon.
So, Willie, fess up. Are you a criminal?
No. No criminal at all. Never been convicted of any crime.
But they had you down as a felon.
Yes, they did, but not me. Wrong person. I've never been arrested in my life, you know. Was in the military for 4 years. Got out of the military, been in the medical field ever since. I mean, you can't even work for a hospital being a convicted felon. And I was in the Persian Gulf War in '91. Fought in the war, so, you know, it's pretty screwed up how they did me, but what can I say?
Tampa elections supervisor Pam Iorio.
If you, in error, remove even one person from the voter rolls, it's of tremendous significance. We found errors. We were very uncomfortable with the matches on the list. The matches that the state considered a match was not something that we necessarily considered a match. Sometimes the race and even the gender was not a match. We were not comfortable.
How did you feel when they said you're a criminal?
Well, for one, I was upset, you know. I was ashamed, you know, with 40 people around. It made me feel real bad. And I'm just hoping that I get a letter stating, hey, you can vote again, Willie.
But Harris never sent the letter, although the state admits Willie is innocent.
I really feel that it was bad, you know, for African Americans, but hey, you know, what can we do sometime? You know, what can we do?
Using some legal snooping techniques, I was able to get into Florida's computers and cracked open the files that named Willie Steen and other black voters as criminals. From Katherine Harris's elections office, I decoded this list of 57,000 names of convicts matched to Florida voters.
Thomas Alvin Cooper is convicted in Ohio. He's a white guy. Thomas Cooper of Florida loses his vote. He's a black guy, and he's listed for a date of conviction of his felony, January 30th, 2007. All it is people who have names similar to someone who's been convicted somewhere in the United States of a crime. 95% of them are completely innocent, should never have lost their vote.
Here's William Osteen, matched to Willie Steen of Florida.
Over half of them are black. Almost every black person voted for Al Gore.
Altogether, 94,000 voters were named as felons. Of these, 95% are innocent. And although black people make up only 13% of Florida's population, more than half the scrub list, 54%, were African American. I flew to the state capitol, to Governor Jeb Bush's office tower, to find out who came up with this fake felon list that elected our president.
All those innocent black voters, thousands who lost their vote. Was it just a coincidence?
Not according to this document, which fell into my hands, which proves that the election was signed, sealed, and delivered long before any ballot was cast. The state hired a company called DBT Choice Point. This document, marked confidential and secret, indicates that the company was paid millions to create lists of criminals who should be barred from voting, and then verify that those lists were correct. But Florida state officials told Choice Point not to bother verifying the names, despite Choice Point warnings that it could mean thousands of innocent people would end up losing their vote. And First Brother Jeb Bush is also implicated in the illegal voter purge. His office blocked the registration of 50,000 new voters, almost every one a Democrat. In this letter, Jeb's office denies the letter exists. At the heart of the felon fix is this man, Katherine Harris's aide, Clayton Roberts, Harris's director of elections. I took my BBC television crew to Florida's Capitol building to meet up with Harris's operative.
18th floor, Division of Elections. We've come to ask Mr. Clayton Roberts, the director, a few questions.
But when I began to ask him about the documents marked secret, he became a little uncomfortable.
We have a statute that says we have to have a private company to do this. We put it out for bid. They got the bid. And I think I'm done with this interview.
Wait, well, let me just show you the contract, if I could. Mr. Roberts, wait. It says here, right in the contract, that the verification is supposed to be done by DBT, that you paid them $4 million. Don't you it could look to other people that you paid $4 million to purchase this election for the Republican Party? Mr. Roberts?
Instead, Mr. Roberts called in the state troopers to remove us from the governor's office building.
It's interesting here, huh?
Oh, man, never dull moment. Y'all have a good one.
Now that the votes are counted, it is time for the votes to count.
In accordance with the laws of the state of Florida, I hereby declare Governor George W. Bush the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes for the President of the United States. I wish to point out that our American democracy has triumphed once again.
It is a special day for America. It's a day in which our nation confirms the fact that we trust democracy, a peaceful transfer of power.
Thank you, and may God bless America.
To the corporations that put him into the White House, George W. Bush was an investment that paid off big time. Take that company that came up with the phony felon list, Choice Point. They got it 95% wrong, but they didn't get the boot. They got the big no-bid contracts, including one for $67 million to help Bush fight his war on terror.
And they weren't the only company helpful to Bush's election to hit the White House jackpot.
George W. Bush, as governor and now as president, is an absolute corporate wet dream.
Dreams and schemes hatched in these glass towers of Texas.
Looks powerful, looks invincible. In fact, it's the gravestone here in Houston of what was the largest power corporation on this planet, Enron. Here's something that caught my eye. Bush takes office. Just 3 days later, he signs an executive order that raises the price of electricity in California. Nearly bankrupts that state, but earns these guys billions. Now, why would our president do that?
Jim Hightower, once the Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Texas, is now a radio columnist. From inside government and out, he's tracked the Bush family's mix of politics and payouts for years.
I'd trust a wolf to guard my last pork chop before I'd trust the Bushites to guard my liberties.
Any fantasy that the boss of a major corporation has can come true if you just put in some money into Bush's personal or political pockets. They're very loyal to each other and to those who are loyal to them. They stand and deliver for those who put money into their politics or into their personal accounts.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Enron puts in a few $100,000 into Bush's presidential campaign. In the first 5 or 6 months of the administration, it reaps hundreds of millions of dollars in personal benefit.
Texas Republic Justice Chief Craig McDonald is a modern-day vigilante who follows the political money trail.
Here's Ken Lay, who's the CEO of Enron. He delivered hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Bush campaign. This is the power team. They hit the long ball, and they can put you all the way in the White House. The Pioneer Network was built by George W. Bush off the network of cronies, acquaintances, and funders that his father had during presidency. They built this network not just out of whole cloth, but it had been a network that helped the family dynasty, if you will.
To be a pioneer, you have to pledge to raise at least $100,000 for the Bush candidacy.
These were pioneers who were plowing new ground to create record amounts of money for Bush's run for the presidency. The legal limit for anyone to give to the campaign is $1,000.
So the way they get around that campaign limit is you get a corporate executive who wants favors from the incoming Bush administration, who will tap his family, extended family, corporate colleagues, country club pals, golf buddies, etc., raking up $1,000 checks and bundle them up into $100,000 plus contributions to George W.'s presidential ambition.
After the first year of Bush entering the White House, 43 of his elite group of pioneers received lush government appointments. They personally benefited. 19 of them appointed to ambassadorships.
Even before he takes the presidential oath, Bush forms a secret task force, including Enron's Ken Lay, to rewrite America's environmental and energy laws.
He put the very people who funded him in the room to devise a clean air policy. They wrote the policy, he enacted the policy, and the policy was strictly voluntary. Did nothing to clean up the air, yet he touted it as a major accomplishment.
Instead of the government telling utilities where and how to cut pollution, we will give them a firm deadline and let them find the most innovative ways to meet it.
These same funders were sick and tired of trying to play by the environmental rules and regulations. George Bush gave them an environmental clean air policy that any corporation would lust after.
How proud we are to be the #1 state in the country in air pollution.
Ken Lay got almost total, complete energy deregulation out of George Bush.
What did the Bush administration do? It refused to impose price controls, to put a cap on those utility prices, meaning a company like Enron could set its own prices to consumers.
Show me the money. Show me the money.
He was delivering a favor and a policy that the donors who put him in that office wanted.
Consumers in California were being stiffed, and Enron was raking in hundreds of millions of dollars during that period in corrupt profits. So that's a pretty good payback.
But Enron squandered their California windfall in a series of spectacular frauds, which imploded, leaving thousands jobless and pensioners bankrupt. Now, George tried to downplay his links with Enron's Ken Lay and other corrupt bosses.
By far, the vast majority of CEOs in America are good, honorable, honest people. In the corporate world, sometimes things aren't exactly black and white when it comes to accounting procedures, and the SEC's job is to look and is to determine whether or not the decision by the auditors was the appropriate decision.
Ken Lay, whom George W. fondly called Kenny Boy, was the major campaign contributor to George W. Bush, and they exchanged Christmas cards with each other. Ken Lay was very personal, very close with the Bush family.
I do know that Mr. Lay came to the White House early in my administration, along with I think 20 other business leaders to discuss the state of the economy. It was just kind of a general discussion. I have not met with him personally.
I've gotten my hands on a video of an Enron retirement party for one of Ken Lay's colleagues. It stars both Presidents Bush, more than happy to say a few encouraging words for their family's top campaign contributors.
You have been fantastic to the Bush family. I don't think anybody did more than you did to support George.
Don't leave Texas. You're too good a man. I appreciate your service to our great state. I look forward to working with you to make Texas a better place. Good luck in anything you do. You're a good Texan.
Austin, Texas, Capitol Hill. It's here where George W. clinched the deals that got him into the White House, where he learned his own particular brand of politics, Texas style. And where the big guns of Austin have their offices. Across from the Capitol, I found one of these, Ken Lay's former lobbyist, Andrea McWilliams. She and her husband sell their political connections to the Texas corporate elite. And they also rounded up over $100,000 in contributions for George W. Bush's presidential campaign. Why?
If every person in the United States could meet President Bush, they would understand why we have the level of support personally that we do for the president. He is an honest, equitable, hard-working man, and that's why we've supported him unequivocally. And I think he's doing a fabulous job.
And I love the phrase, government if necessary, not necessarily government. And, you know, I think of that, and I think of President Bush, because, you know, there are some things that government can do well. In the business environment and in Texas, I think those things, there are few things, but the rest should be left to the private sector.
I crossed the hall to meet another lobbyist. In a room blue with smoke from Havana cigars, Nick Kroll gave me a different view of the influence game.
For a cocktail?
Yeah.
Why not? Cheers.
Damn fine whiskey. Now, do you ever use that as a mechanism for getting what you want in the
Always.
legislature?
The second most important, well, third most important tool in politics.
Well, what are the others? Guns and what?
Money's probably number one, but whiskey's a close second.
And what's third?
Love, I guess. Get our lobby tools ready.
That makes the point. Do you have a few enemies here?
Sure. I'm a minority. I'm a Democrat.
An endangered species, huh?
That's right.
The simple process of getting things done in Texas, how important is cash in getting legislation through?
Well, it's the fuel of politics. I mean, that's how you get people that identify with your views elected. It is probably unseemly in many ways because I could give you $100, $200, I could give you as much, $100,000, $200,000, as much money as I want, and obviously that's going to have some effect on how you treat me.
Say, come on now, you are representing guys like Enron. You're saying that these companies make that type of investment and don't expect a return?
I think some of the donors that you're speaking of, and there's a long list that have traditionally given to what they feel like are business-friendly candidates. And those donors don't necessarily look for any sort of quid pro quo other than the candidate's ideology that they're supporting. They know will help change the business environment or the climate for the better.
What I would say about President Bush is that there is no way giving to someone like him is going to influence his decision. There's no quid pro quo.
Sounds like bullshit to me. Only cost $250,000 to cheat, lie, and steal. Well, it might be more profitable to steal.
So this is kind of the Wild West of campaign contributions?
It is the Wild West. It's the old saying, money talks and bullshit walks.
And money talks very politely to the Bush family. Not just the campaign cash for George W. and Brother Jeb. There was $1 billion the U.S. Treasury pumped into Brother Neil's bank, Silverado. And there's Brother Marvin. His investment funds are fattening on contracts for the War on Terror. And Daddy, Bush Sr., became the first ex-president to sell his Oval Office connections for cash to oil companies and arms dealers.
The Bushes are like other American dynasties, the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, but they've taken the game to a whole other level. See, the money gets them office, then the office gets them even more money. Call it the Bush cycle. And it's still rolling along.
I went to speak to a man who'd witnessed the Bush family's uncanny ability to turn government service into cash. He'd occupied an inside seat in the spook world during the Reagan-Bush administration. Former National Security Agent Wayne Madsen.
It's the nature of the Bush families, particularly Bush Sr., to use contacts made from government service, head of the CIA, vice president, president of the United States, to basically call in favors later on.
Bush Sr. and other former intelligence and political honchos have joined the private Carlyle Group, whose main work is selling arms to the U.S. government and a few dictatorships.
Carlyle uses Senior Bush to make entrees to various government offices around the world, to presidents and prime ministers and kings, sheikhs, emirs, sultans, what have you. But what Bush Sr. gets in return is he's part of these lucrative contracts, and he uses his connections to funnel the money into the Bush family coffers, which finds its way into the Bush campaign machine.
In 1988, George Bush Sr. won the presidency. At this time, a contract was awarded by the government of Bahrain to drill for oil in the Persian Gulf. Surprisingly, it went to a small-time Texas oil driller, Harken Energy, who had little experience in the field. I asked investigative reporter Pete Bruton, then with the Houston Chronicle, how this happened.
Harken Oil in Texas gets an offshore contract to drill in the Persian Gulf.
You know, it's a big mystery to everyone. All the analysts, everybody said, how did this happen? Nobody understood why it happened. Why didn't Amoco, why didn't Texaco, Mobil, Exxon, BP, why didn't they get the contract? They had the capital. Harken didn't have any capital. And I found out it was because George W. Bush, the president's son, and our future president, was on the board of directors.
I followed the money trail back here to the dusty oil fields of Midland, Texas.
In 1950, a Connecticut Yankee named George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. arrived into town with money bags filled with $1 million from his family to buy himself a piece of Texas. And he ended up with the whole enchilada.
This is Senator Prescott Bush with his son George, who wrote the check for George Sr. and George Jr. to enter the oil business.
There's the Lucky Sperm Club. You know, those that were lucky enough to be born into a family with substantial resources.
So this is where it began for our president in the oil business.
That was where I first met George, when he had his company Arbusto.
Arbusto. That's Spanish for Little Bush. There in the 8th floor of the petroleum building. It also got the nickname Arbusto. It was the first of 4 companies that went belly up.
Whoa, it's hot.
Well, yeah, it'll be over 100 today.
Over 100. Whew, look at that. That's one big horsey. Smells like Texas, too.
Smells like money to me.
Harkin Oil will suddenly get this contract to drill offshore from the government of Bahrain, from the Arabs. They beat out Amoco Oil. Is that a little unusual?
Well, it's awfully unusual for a small company to get an offshore concession like that.
You think maybe that they picked up the contract because George W.'s father was president of the free world?
It certainly didn't hurt.
He ended up with millions, 4 companies that got quite some large investments. You know about that?
I think he made his money with his name and being able to keep moving and keep having people put money into his businesses.
So where did this money come from? You have any idea?
Well, my impression is that the money he got was out-of-town money.
Way out of town, from the Persian Gulf. What is the connection between this Gulf oil money for our commander-in-chief and his conduct of the war on terror? After September 11th, the president had tough words for those helping terrorists.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
But before September 11th, our president had very little to say to the Gulf nation where the attackers and their funding originated. America's attacked by 15 Saudi hijackers under the direction of a Saudi named bin Laden. I couldn't find a shred of evidence that George Bush knew about the September 11th attack in advance. But why didn't our intelligence agencies know?
This document is marked secret and WF, which means it walked its way out of the Washington Bureau of the FBI. It indicates that before the attack of September 11th, agents had wanted to question 2 members of a very powerful family for their connections to a suspected terrorist organization, Omar and Abdullah bin Laden. But the agents weren't allowed to. Now, what makes this family so special that they're protected from investigation?
To find out what lay behind the Bush administration's reluctance to look into the bin Laden family, I went back to speak to our fighter pilot, Bill White. He went into business with a mysterious figure, James R. Bath, who managed the U.S. funds of a powerful Saudi family.
I met many times with Salim bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's older brother, both in business settings and in social settings. We had parties there where a lot of the dignitaries and big business bigwigs would party with the Arabs. So it was like La La Land. These guys drove around in limousines with suitcases full of cash. It was just amazing.
And those suitcases full of cash found their way from bin Laden to a man named James R. Bath.
Bath actually presented me with a copy of a trust agreement, a one-page trust agreement that was signed in 1976 that appointed him as sole and exclusive representative for the Saudi bin Laden family in the United States of America and all their business ventures.
And that bin Laden money allowed Bath to invest in another flyboy, our future president.
Oh, that's right, George Bush Jr. and Arbusto. That's correct.
Do you know about that?
Well, I know about it because Jim and I had to provide our personal financials to our lenders. And so I looked at his personal financial, and they're, plain as day. It said, Arbusto 79, $25,000, Arbusto 80, $25,000.
So Bush's oil capital came from Bath, and Bath's money came apparently from the bin Ladens. But why would they plow money into W's oil company?
The money that Bath put into Arbusto was nothing but an extension of this quid pro quo relationship between the Saudi royal family and the Bushes. The Saudi royal family was deathly afraid of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the radical Islamic movement. And so at that point in time, they went to the Bushes and said, look, protect us from the Ayatollah and these radical fundamentalists, and we'll give you whatever you want for your campaigns and to fund your kids' business interests, to fight your secret wars.
There were other connections between the Bushes and the Saudis. Carlyle Group, which hired both George Bush Jr. and Sr., received major funds and work from Saudi royals and the bin Laden family. Of course, not all of them were terrorists, but the question is whether the dazzle of Gulf money blinded the Bushes to real threats. I met with Stephen Push, whose wife was one of the 3,000 people who died on September 11th. He's a spokesman for the families of the attack's victims, who have been struggling to open government files on Saudi involvement with al-Qaeda.
Do you feel that the government is doing all they can to fully investigate what happened?
It's been very difficult. The Bush administration originally opposed the idea of doing any kind of investigation whatsoever. One thing that the joint 9/11 inquiry has had difficulty getting declassified is information about Saudi Arabia. And I suspect that that may be part of the reason why the Bush administration is reluctant to fully disclose what they did prior to 9/11, because even after 9/11 they've maintained a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that may be playing some role, or maybe coloring the president's judgment in how he's dealing with the problem of Saudi cooperation on terrorism.
Were the Saudis given special treatment, shielded from investigation into royal funding of terrorist fronts? For some answers, I arranged to meet with Ron Motley, the world's richest lawyer. He beat the tobacco companies and won billions. Now he's using his winnings to fund an international intelligence network to find out who funded the terrorists.
Saudis, before September 11th, do you think that they were given kind of a free ride, given a little extra slack about funding terrorism?
I believe that. Evidence has been uncovered that in the early summer of 2001, several FBI agents who were tasked with trying to find out how al-Qaeda was getting its money were shut down. The evidence is clear and unequivocal from 1995 all the way through September of 2001. Our agencies were fully aware that part of al-Qaeda's master plan was to hijack a United States airplane and crash it into a site of financial or military power in the United States. Unequivocal evidence. That's now well known. It wasn't well known to the public. It was well known to the FAA and the airlines and to the FBI and the CIA, and it was made known. It was made known. We've developed evidence that's unequivocal that in 1999, in the Clinton administration, dispatched a high official of the National Security Council and a high official from the Department of Treasury to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they sat down with government officials and banking officials, laid out the case that the Saudi-sponsored charities and certain banks and certain individuals from the Persian Gulf were giving money to these so-called religious charities, which were funding al-Qaeda's operations.
Did those warnings from the United States government continue under George Bush?
To my knowledge, there was not an official delegation dispatched by the Bush administration to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states prior to September 11th. But there was certainly a drumbeat of information coming our way that al-Qaeda planned a major operation against the United States on our soil.
So pressure was taken off the Saudis suspected of backing Osama bin Laden before September 11th. Motley represents victims of the attack, So I asked him if the Bush administration had gone easy on the rest of the bin Laden family.
How come airlines were allowed to take the bin Laden family out of the United States and away from being interrogated by the FBI? Number one. Number two, we obtained from the Bosnian intelligence services, Sarajevo, a copy of what's called the Golden Chain, which listed, Al-Qaeda listed their most generous contributors, and it included the bin Laden family.
The Golden Chain document is evidence that in the early days, some members of the bin Laden family were funding al-Qaeda operations in the Balkans.
That document was seized by the FBI and the Bosnian police, and the Supreme Court of Bosnia has authenticated the document.
In your complaint, you talk about a meeting between Saudi billionaires and Saudi money men and al-Qaeda in Paris.
At this hotel, the Monceau Royal, in June 1995, the sheikhs at the alleged al-Qaeda fundraiser included business partners of our president. Motley would not let me state the names, but he verified the guest list.
Well, I actually took your list and had someone approach a European intelligence agency and ask if all those people that were on your list, in fact, were at the meeting, and they agreed that they were.
What does this administration have to fear about a full investigation of terrorism?
I don't know that they do, but maybe they're concerned that some of their friends or some strategic interest might be compromised or revealed to have been sponsors of terrorism.
So we're back to the question we began with. Where are this family and their friends leading us? On March 17, 2003, from the Oval Office, our president declared war on Iraq.
My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision.
And then he spoke directly to the Iraqi people.
Listen carefully to this warning. Do not destroy oil wells.
Do not destroy oil wells. So why did we go into Iraq? And why are we still there? In February 2003, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer announced our new crusade.
Ongoing aspects of Operation Iraqi Liberation.
Operation Iraqi Liberation.
Subliminal messages. I don't think we need to be subliminal.
And there's nothing subliminal about this. Confidential maps and plans from inside the White House's locked file cabinets.
And this is where the Bush cycle leads to this document, which the men in this House would rather you not see. It's the confidential plan written long before the war started to divide and sell off all of Iraq's assets, especially the oil.
Especially the oil. George Bush's former Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, charges that Bush began planning the war as soon as he took office. But did the plan go beyond ousting Saddam Hussein to imposing a radical free market makeover of the Iraqi economy? This is General Jay Garner, the man who should know. Last April, he rolled into Baghdad with the Bush team's classified plan for economic conquest.
All I can tell you is the plans were pretty elaborate. I mean, they didn't start them in 2002. They were started in 2001.
Hundreds of pages of the secretly produced strategy lay out the changes to policies, laws, and regulations to allow Americans to own Iraqi banks and businesses, design Iraq's tax policies, and more. Who was invited in to draw up Iraq's laws? Not the Iraqis. Grover Norquist, the super lobbyist, was called into the inner circle 6 months before the war.
I worked with lots of different people, talked to guys in Treasury, Defense, State, White House, moving these ideas forward, sometimes getting feedback of, oh, yes, we're doing that, other times, oh, that's a good idea. I wanted to make sure that property rights was on everybody's list of things to get done.
While the general said elections would have put a halt to killings of Americans, the corporate lobbyist explained why Iraqis should not be allowed to vote for years.
Some things predate and are bigger than and are more important than the state being chosen by an election.
Privatization, not democracy, was at the center of the secret Bush program, especially in the oil industries. Garner didn't oppose America's buying up the oil fields, but he doubted it would be popular.
That's just one fight that you don't have to take on right now. I'm a believer that you don't want to end the day with more enemies than you started with.
Garner refused to force the Bush plan down the throats of the Iraqis. He called for elections and was fired on the spot.
The night I got to Baghdad, Secretary Rumsfeld called me and told me that the president was appointing Jerry Bremer as the presidential envoy, and that was all.
Indications are the Bush administration may have had its eye on Iraq's oil from the start. The evidence was discovered by a most unlikely source.
Hey, Tom, glad to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Great.
Tom Fitton runs Judicial Watch, a conservative think tank.
I was strongly supportive of the Iraqi war, and I thought it should have been done more quickly, and frankly, there are a few other countries I'd like to go to war on.
But Fitton discovered the evidence that Vice President Dick Cheney was going over maps of Iraq with oil company executives.
You know, the issue is whether or not the invasion of Iraq was for legitimate national security purposes. And many Americans wouldn't have seen it as legitimate if it was put in terms of, we need to get Iraqi oil.
Each of these splotches represents an oil field and a battlefield for American soldiers, and a potential profit center for those who created the Bush family fortunes.
You follow the money, and you come back to this: oil. Drilling it, funding it, controlling it. War, peace, terror. War on terror. It's all in the family's business. And in this business, oil is thicker than blood.
Do not fight for a dying regime that is not worth your own life. Should I threaten our national security interests, there will be reprisal.